Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. This is a panel about AI surveillance. My name is Kashmir Hill. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a reporter at the New York Times. I write about privacy. I've been writing about kind of the use of our data for about a decade. And as we were preparing for this panel, I was just thinking about the ways that technology used to judge us when I first started writing about this. And one of the big stories at the time was that the site Orbitz, if you came in on an Apple device, you would be shown higher priced hotel rooms. And if you came in on an Android device, you would be shown lower priced hotel rooms. And the CEO of Orbitz said, you know, we've just seen that people who use Apple devices like to spend more money. And, you know, that is certainly a misjudgment. Not everybody who has an iPhone wants the most expensive hotel room. Since then, you know, only more data has been collected about us. The technology has become, you know, much more complicated. The algorithms are more complicated. We're judged, you know, in many more ways, many more times per day. But we still have the same kind of flaws and misjudgments that happen when the algorithms are flawed and the technology is flawed. So we are going to talk about this until about 12:45 and then open it up to audience questions. I just want to start off by having everybody on the panel introduce themselves. We will start with Deb, and then Rashida, and then Hannah.
Hi, I'm Deb Raji. I'm currently a Mozilla Fellow, and I do a lot of work on algorithmic accountability. I worked with Joy Buolamwini at the MIT Media Lab on a project called Gender Shades, where we evaluated the performance of commercial facial recognition systems on different demographic subgroups, mostly looking at lighter and darker skinned individuals and male and female, and finding out that these models performed much worse on darker skinned females than any other demographic subgroup. So a lot of my work has been, working on additional audits like that and trying to think of structuring theory around how we set up these audits and how we evaluate things.
Rashida?
My name is Rashida Richardson, pronoun she, hers, and I'm a visiting scholar at Rutgers Law School. My background is as a civil rights lawyer that's worked on a range of technology issues over the years, but right now my scholarship focuses on the civil rights implications of what I call data-driven technology. So that's a full spectrum of different technologies, and I tend to emphasize work around racial justice concerns, and I also develop policy remedies for the problems that come up in my work and a lot of the other emergent research in this area.
Hi, everybody. My name is Hannah Sassaman. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a community organizer based in Philadelphia. I've worked at the intersection of technology, race, and economic justice my whole life. I'm the policy director of a community organization called Movement Alliance Project. I have been lucky enough to get to focus on algorithmic decision-making, primarily in a legal context, big focus on pretrial uses of these algorithms, and I'm helping to spearhead a project looking at how algorithms impact human dignity in a variety of other contexts, centered with organizing directly with people impacted by tools of this nature and trying to transform systems that oppress them. And I'm really grateful to be here with you.
So we have a lawyer, a journalist, a technologist, and a community organizer, which is all the elements that you need for a great story on algorithmic bias. And I just want to mention on the ONA page itself, the MacArthur Foundation has put together some great resources. One is just kind of a background on algorithmic bias, kind of the terms that you want to be familiar with, some articles there with the kind of basics, building blocks that you would need for stories. And then they have a great list of experts, including many of the people, including all the people in this Zoom room and many, many people I've called on for many stories. So one thing I wanted to start with is just if you guys, I mean, in the room we have journalists, local journalists who are looking for stories about problems with technology in their communities. And so I was hoping you guys could talk about some examples of example of a story that you've been involved in as a source, a tipster who spotted the idea, just to give people in the room kind of an idea of what kind of stories they could be looking for. Let's start this time. Let's go backwards and start with Hannah.
Sure. So it's been a really incredible journey working with communities to help to talk about how algorithmic decision-making has impacted their freedom and their lives. There's been a couple of different stories that have been really great. We got a chance to work with Cade Metz, who's a journalist with you, Kashmir, at the New York Times, who did a really great piece that I think is now hopefully getting shared with you in the public chat, that focused on sort of the nuances about how pretrial algorithms actually work in a decision-making context. Too often, a lot of journalism about technology and human rights is just like, no algorithm, bad algorithm, technology bad, or objective, hopeful, shiny, gosh, wow. It's like one of those two poles. And he did a really deep dive into the impact of those tools in that actual decision-making system, which is Byzantine, which is bureaucratic, which is different from tiny courthouse, tiny jurisdiction to state all over the country. And by understanding the nuances of how those tools truly worked, how they truly impacted a very individualized decision, as well as then getting stories from people impacted by those tools who felt empowered to tell them because they trusted the integrity of the journalist. They trusted that that story wasn't taking something from them and exposing like really deep hurts inside their lives. Like being judged by a bail commissioner is potentially one of the most impactful things that happens to you. You know, if you're being judged, it's the worst day of your life if you're in front of a court, right? But really talks about it in terms of like the organizing vision that those individuals and their community organizations had, meant that that story was extraordinarily impactful in that journalism. There was another great piece.
Hannah, with that story specifically, is that something where Cade came to you and was asking if you had seen the effects of these pretrial risk assessments? How did the two of you end up working together?
That's a great question. So Cade is he came, I think, out of Wired before he was at the Times. He's a tech reporter. Like, he's someone who focuses on technology. And he came to us after, I think, digging into the tech, thinking about some of the state regulations, laws getting passed that said, go ahead, exchange bail, which is deeply unfair, which really, looks at you based on whether or not you can pay your way out, rather than whether you are risky of not coming back to court, or risky of getting arrested again for any kind of charge or a violent charge, rather than sort of focusing just on those tropes, like how these tools are built and what they're meant to do and how they're sold, actually looking at how they impacted communities. So we did a deep dive in Philadelphia and a deep dive in a variety of other jurisdictions, which was deeply impactful, specifically because if you are a legislator or a court administrator or a bureaucrat, you're not going to actually have the technical wherewithal to be able to know all of the potential trade-offs of tools of this nature, whether or not you're trading, an error rate balance, like how often the tool is wrong about you, with predictive parity, meaning it's as predictive for a black person than a white person or a Latinx person, right? And so those nuances matter, but it's much easier to cast them into relief when you do deep studies into the actual impacts of those tools in live systems, and then actually do the human storytelling in an accountable way, with someone who can say, this is how that tool would have or did judge me, and here's who I am as a person. And then you can have really rigorous reporting, which actually helps with organizing, to be able for those stories to be centered. So we were really grateful that he did that reporting with us.
Yeah, I mean, ideally for any journalist, I think you have the human story, but then you need to understand the systems that underlay these, so you can explain the flaws. Rashida, you're going to talk about one of the most important investigations of this year. So I'd love if you could share that story and how you helped on it.
Yeah, so the example I wanted to highlight is the Tampa Bay Times did a story on the prolific offender list used by the Pasco County Sheriff's Office. And that was a deep investigation into a technology that on its name doesn't seem like something like tech, because it's essentially highlighting people for the sheriff's office to target and essentially harass. And I think they did a great way of highlighting the sort of myriad of issues and concerns around impact, and how families were not just temporarily inconvenienced, but there were long-term consequences and even fatal consequences that were the result of these aggressive policing practices. And I also think it helped highlight some of the logics behind why government adopts these technologies, which is not always transparent when we are focusing on the harms, which I think should be the focus. And the way that I got involved is because this is an area of research. So the reporters saw a law review I had written about predictive policing and using the term dirty data, which is traditionally used in machine data mining sector, but I expanded it to include what happens in law enforcement and a lot of the problems with government data broadly, but specifically police data. And they were mostly engaging me to look at a lot of the background documents and understand how these practices in the system that was being used in Pasco County related to other jurisdictions that I researched, or where I have worked with defense attorneys on challenging similar systems, and also to compare and contrast some of the practices and outcomes that happened in Pasco County, to see if that was also relating to what I had seen in other jurisdictions. And the short answer is yes. But this is actually one of the most, and I just kept saying, this is so egregious on the call, because it was such an egregious case, and really played into some of the dynamics that were happening regionally in that area.
And do you know how the journalists found out about this kind of predictive policing program that the sheriff was using to? It was basically to identify problem youth, right? Like it was.
Yeah, so they ended up disproportionately targeting a lot of young people, but it was supposed to target prolific offenders, so people who had committed several violent crimes. But the reality is most of the people targeted had not committed any crime at all or any violent crime and didn't even meet the criteria that they had. But the way that they actually found this story was from a lawsuit from officers that were penalized for not complying with these practices. And they were also, and they looked through court records for that lawsuit and also RICO, which is a larger conspiracy case that was happening in that area. And so I was just pointing out that this is actually more of a commonality when you're looking at these systems, because they're often used to then lead to conspiracy cases because the standards for meeting those types of charges are fairly low, or you can use a lot of circumstantial evidence to bring those charges. So I was just helping giving them some context on how the case that led them to finding this system is actually part of a larger problem in this country.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating what you can find when you have those basically employment lawsuits, and that people become whistleblowers through talking about things that are happening in the workplace. Another good resource I've found, kind of looking for people talking about internal programs, is LinkedIn. People will often talk about, I'm in charge of this program. People have found NSA code names for programs there because people will talk about things they've worked on, even though they're classified. Deb, can you talk about a story that you have been involved in?
Yeah, I was like, oh, that's wild, on LinkedIn. I mentioned two stories, actually, one of which, I was very involved in, and probably is the most sort of relevant to, the work that I do. So when we audited, working with Joy at the Media Lab and with her Algorithmic Justice League, we were auditing a bunch of commercial facial recognition tools. So these are, products that are being sold by these big 10 companies to execute facial recognition analysis tasks, one being gender classification. And we evaluated the performance of these systems on different skin types. And when we audited Amazon, we found that there was a stark difference in terms of the performance of Amazon's facial recognition products on different skin types. And it intersected almost purposefully by design with an ACLU campaign that was happening that same summer that we had worked on this, where they had discovered that Amazon was pitching their facial recognition tool, the same one that we had audited, to police departments and to ICE for use in surveillance practice. So it was an interesting intersection where we audited a tool that was, discovered by the ACLU to be in the process of being pitched to ICE and police departments. So that combination of Amazon is trying to sell this product to police departments, and this product does not actually work for people of color, sparked a story. And one of your colleagues at the New York Times, Natalie Singer, I think, is the one that put that together so beautifully to kind of narrate the dangers of these products not working for specific communities, especially when the same product is being pitched for these terrifying surveillance applications where a mismatch could definitely cause or lead to a horrific outcome for those affected. So it was an incredible sort of moment of connecting the research with a lot of the advocacy work and telling that narrative cohesively. I was going to say the other sort of example of my favorite algorithmic justice story is that of Atlantic Towers, which was a bunch of tenants that were pushing back against the landlord's installation of facial recognition. And I really love the reporting in the Guardian sort of story that I link here, where they really do a good job humanizing the tenants and digging into their concerns. And this is something that I found after our research was published. They had actually cited our work in their letter that they had sent to the landlord, that they had sent to advocates to defend their position, to push back against the use of facial recognition. And their interpretation of our audited work was really that of, we as tenants understand the nature of our relationship with this particular landlord and the risk that comes with empowering that landlord to install facial recognition. And this, for us, this audit result that this technology doesn't work for people of our skin type is evidence for us that this technology was not built for our benefit and is not built for us. And it was such a incredible interpretation of what those audit results mean and how that research can get sort of translated and how it becomes meaningful to individuals. And I think the reporting in The Guardian did a good job sort of representing that view. So that was a really great article as well.
Yeah, I mean, your work on bias in face recognition, it was a huge story. And I think it changed the conversation about facial recognition. It led, a year later to NIST, the basically federal agency that studies facial recognition, doing a similar study. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's, it just was not talked about widely before. And now it's a footnote on almost any story about facial recognition. Mm-hmm. And again, it's, people in academia that are really digging into these products, different kinds of technologies. There's academic papers that have stories in them. Yeah. And sometimes they get attention and sometimes they don't, but it is a place to go looking for stories and see who's studying these technologies and what they're finding. I want to ask you guys quickly. So we've talked about successful stories that have been done on algorithmic surveillance. What do you think is out there that hasn't been covered that journalists in this session might look at? Things that are, products that are being used in their local communities that they should be investigating, looking more closely at to see if there are stories there. And at this time, I will start with Rashida and then go to Hannah and then Deb.
So rather than focus on technology, I'm just going to emphasize sectors because I think there's a tendency, or at least there's been a lot of reporting about uses in the criminal justice system. And that's because a lot of these technologies have carceral logics baked into them. And that's where a lot of the development starts. But there's also a lot of concerning, and I would even go as far to say nefarious systems being used in education. And I think that has proliferated, especially this year with the pandemic and a lot of people having to move online and schools kind of panicking and adopting a lot of questionable ed tech. And I know there's been lots of coverage on digital divide issues, but also a lot of these technologies have the same sort of racism issues as facial recognition. So there's been stories of students having to take exams with hot lamps on them because otherwise the system won't see them. There's lots of problematic uses of data-driven technologies or even predictive analytics in the child welfare system and other public benefit systems. So whether we're talking about Medicaid, Medicare, or SNAP benefits, more and more administrative agencies are turning to database solutions to either help with decision making or help with the allocation of public resources. And what we find is that these types of systems, often when they rely on government data, are more likely to penalize poor people, people of color, and people with disabilities, or really any marginalized group within a community. So I think there just needs to be more of an expansive look at the proliferation of these tools throughout government, and also raise awareness that it's not only within certain sectors that there are specific harms, but many of these harms are related in that you can use a system in the education system that may expedite a kid into the criminal justice system. Sort of structural impacts.
My next question will be, how journalists can uncover those stories. But, find out in your community what kids are expected to put on their computers right now to monitor them doing their schoolwork. Hannah, do you want to address this one?
Sure. And I think Rashida's frame is absolutely right. It's not what tool should we dig into, although sometimes it is that, what fresh horror we'd like to explore today. But often it's so I think that one of the things to think about in terms of technologies, especially predictive analytics, is that systems meant to sort people, to make a guess about them, have been using some kind of prediction, usually for generations. Like you can go back if you're looking at the criminal legal system, like the idea of bail as a surety to try to guess whether or not someone will come back or not is like almost 1,000 years old, back to like medieval England and things like that. So I'm doing a lot of work right now with my colleagues at Movement Alliance Project, and Rashida mentioned focusing on this as well, into the child welfare system. And so the thing that is the most scary about algorithms or predictive technologies in a system like that is that that's a system that where you have so little ability to face your accuser. The tools in that system, for example, are tautological. Have you been called in by a mandated reporter, or has someone come to investigate you or your family before? Then the tools use that as an actual factor in trying to predict whether or not you will be investigated again. So when in a court of law, you would actually, some like the idea of an arrest versus a conviction are very different things. And we've actually had direct fights around criminal legal algorithms to be like, can you actually not use arrests as the thing you're predicting for? Because that's actually predicting the behavior of the cops. And it's not even, a proven anything of any sort. Like there's even less of that in the criminal or in the child welfare system. If the algorithm labels you as scary, if anything about your investigation is found to be founded, that label stays on you forever. Like there's folks who are dealing with the impacts of a child neglect or a child abuse determination that can't get jobs for 30 years because of that kind of thing. And then the data in that system, and I think that this relates as well to what Rashida is saying, like we make guesses about people and their ability and whether or not they're going to be okay. And this is almost always about the color of their skin or their class, based on how other systems categorize them too. There's a child welfare algorithm that's deployed in Pittsburgh, for example, that uses data from the criminal legal system that engages in some cases about whether or not you have had access to benefits, things of that nature. If you've ever had a mental health challenge, like places where I might be seen as by the system as like seeking help and not being in a place of judgment. If I'm Black or brown or poor, those different sort of data points are surveilled a lot more closely and are used against me. And those systems interlock in really detailed ways. I would say that Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks has done some of the best jobs of the relationships between these systems and where technology sort of serves in a banality of evil kind of way. Like when someone who is, a white person or not a technologist and definitely not someone who's an organizer or has been impacted by these systems takes a look at a list of factors or looks at a database for different systems and is like, seems cool to me, check, that suddenly can be judging an entire population in a much, much worse way with extraordinarily high consequences.
Yeah, I think anytime you're telling a story about one of these systems, you really have to dig into how the system works. What kind of data is being collected about people, and you'll sometimes hear, well, we're not using race as a classification. Like the system doesn't see race, but it sees it some other way. So you have a zip code that basically correlates with what a person's ethnicity is or some other factor. And then, how did they build the system? Are they looking back at 20 years of judgments that have been made about people that are inherently biased? And so it's not just looking at now. You have to look into the past and what the system is built on. And then Deb, I want you to answer this question, and then we're going to start bringing in some of the audience questions.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love the conversation so far, by the way. I was going to say, I think there's definitely something that Rashida mentioned that I want to go back to, which is this reality that we are in unprecedented times right now. Right now is sort of a time unlike any other, due to the pandemic, but also sort of, the international sort of movement happening in solidarity with racial justice issues, the economic situation that we're in. This is just like a really crazy time where a lot of things are happening. And I think something that I've begun to realize is how a lot of this algorithmic accountability work intersects with a lot of that. We're in a period where people are almost more reliant than ever before on their devices, on their understanding of what the digital realm is, which is sort of what's on the other side of my screen. However, they're still kind of vulnerable to all of these algorithms outside of the website that they're on, that dictate different parts of their lives. So an example would be like tenant screening tools that the Markup, which is a great investigative sort of it's like a group of investigative reporters focused on tech issues. The Markup wrote this excellent article discussing, different examples of algorithms that impact people's lives without them even understanding that it's there. And I think that idea of these invisible algorithms where there is no disclosure by any kind of government agency as to how that algorithm intersects with people's lives is a huge opportunity. So for example, in immigration, definitely understudied the way in which, and the government is now mandated to release these privacy impact statements around the different tools that go through the procurement process for, the Department of Defense and other agencies. Homeland Security is, these documents, they record these documents of all the ways in which the algorithms show up as part of the immigration process. But there's not been a lot of work done so far in terms of investigating, like taking those leads and like really running with them to try to understand like who is this vendor that keeps showing up, or how does this actually play out as part of our understanding of the immigration pipeline and the immigration ecosystem. So really understanding that, it's not just like algorithms are here and, oh, immigration is my beat and that's a separate issue. Or, during COVID, we have this economic crisis or this racial injustice crisis happening, and that's a separate thing from this algorithm situation. I think all of these topics are very closely interwoven. For example, I was talking to someone that identifies as a tenant organizer, and was trying to sort of, pitch that work to journalists, not understanding or not realizing that a lot of their work in tenant organizing had actually been connected to issues on, this property technology landlord tech work that the AI Now Institute has now been doing work on through the postdoc Erin McIlroy. So they sort of found ways to engage tenant organizers in algorithmic justice issues. And by virtue of that, journalists working in this real estate space, working on, housing justice issues or worker justice issues, actually have this inroad into exploring how algorithms change these conversations that they've been having for a very long time on these issues. So I think that, again, to sort of resonate with what Hannah and Rashida said, it's not necessarily a question of, what don't people look at, though I do think that there are specific, down to the vendor where I'm like, people should look at Cognitech. Like there's like specific vendors that I could probably say, I don't think people take enough of a good look at these specific vendors, but I think more helpfully, whatever beat is sort of your thing, understanding that there's definitely a way that algorithms and AI intersects with that in some way, is deployed in some way. And it's just a question of really beginning to run with those leads and connect it to these conversations that have been happening for a long time in those spaces.
So a lot of the questions coming in are kind of how do we uncover these stories? And so one thing you just mentioned are privacy impact statements that get released federally that will explore, some of these issues, and you sometimes find stories there. A lot of some people are talking about FOIA here. Any tips for filing public records requests with local law enforcement about their use of surveillance technology? One thing I do want to mention is that in the resources, there's a sample FOIA for how you inquire about these things. So definitely take a look at that. And then I believe Hannah wanted to address this question too. Do you want to say anything about tips for filing FOIAs with local law enforcement?
Oh, sure. And I think that like the research that Rashida in particular has done and the work concretely that she has done on this over her career is probably the strongest example. But like the shorthand I would say is that if it's a new technology, if it's a technology that as a journalist, you're newer to understanding yourself, as most of us are, and if the legal framework of how the information that you're trying to get out of this technology or the system this technology sorts or interacts with is not yet clear, work very carefully and closely to frame your question in the narrowest way you can, because we've multiple times gotten stuff like slapped back to us because we didn't frame it correctly, basically. And they're like, oh, what do you mean by that? And things like that. And then especially if you're dealing with court systems or other public systems, there's other regulations and restrictions limiting what you can get. And so like, there's just good examples out there. There's actually some fantastic ones that Ellen Goodman, who's a Rutgers professor as well, has gathered with a variety of sources at Muckrock. So it's a great crib place to start from, especially if you're a journalist with less access to resources. And they're really open and psyched to talk to people. And so I would just say that we're starting to build this like bones now of what is the rigorous way that like legal requests, FOIAs, right to knows, FOILs can be structured to get information that's actionable, both for your storytelling and frankly, also for our organizing.
Yeah, I mean, Muckrock is a great resource for, seeing if somebody has already requested what you're going to request, and then, seeing the ways that people got it, how they wrote the request, et cetera. Rashida, you want to answer some questions here. Did you want to answer that one, or do you want to answer one of the other ones? And if you want to answer one of the other ones, you want to just read it and then answer it?
Yeah, so I wanted to respond to the question that said, aside from lawsuits, what other forms of data, structured or unstructured, should journalists be keeping tabs on or keep abreast of? And this is more about sourcing. I would recommend looking at procurement documents put out by government. Like I remember several years ago when I was at the ACLU, I was creeping through the New York City Record, which is where they post everything happening in the city, including procurement notices. And that's when we found out the city was planning to procure Vigilant Solutions, which is an automated license plate reader company, and they have one of the largest databases nationally. And we essentially had to have an investigator go to a basement in the city and handwrite notes because they didn't have public or digitized records. But that was something of like just reading small print in a 40-page document we noticed. So sometimes it is helpful because you'll get an idea of what cities are either looking for. Sometimes they'll post requests for information, which is more, or requests for questions, which are more looking for what's out there on the market, not necessarily stating what the government wants. And then that way you have an idea, oh, they're looking for these types of systems. Or alternatively, they're specifically requesting a type of technology. And at least it gives journalists a heads up of what specific agencies are looking for.
When I was working on the Clearview AI story about the face recognition app that had scraped the web of photos, I heard that it existed and that local law enforcement was using it. And then I wanted to, find detectives who had used the app and tell me about it. And so I basically just did Clearview AI, a Google search, and then, the site to .gov, and Clearview AI just appeared on a whole bunch of city budgets. And so then I would just go to those cities, and sometimes the police are, quite secretive about surveillance technologies that they're using. But with Clearview AI, I had detectives who wanted to talk to me about it because they thought it was so awesome. And so, getting in through procurement documents and through city budgets, sometimes just look at what the police are spending money on, and you might see some vendors pop up that are surprising. Another question from the audience: what trend are you watching in terms of private-public surveillance partnerships and governments buying private surveillance technology? Things like Amazon Ring cameras, Clearview AI systems, gunshot detector systems, impact on communities. Are there existing ones that you don't think are getting attention, public attention, or are there new ones that are starting to pop up that you guys are paying attention to?
In terms of particular products or particular just categories of?
I would say categories of, something that is a private collection of data that is then being redirected into government hands.
This is connected to your last question around FOIA. I wanted to just, not to derail the conversation, but just to address that very briefly. I think there's been excellent work by different researchers and different advocacy groups in the form of like lawsuits to get information and data as well. So I can share a link, but there's like ICE's risk assessment tools that they use to sort of identify suspects for, to chase down effectively for deportation. There's a group at Duke Law School that's been doing a lot of work trying to get information about that. And as part of their research process, they publish their thinking on these topics, and they also release some of that data as part of their publication. And I know the ACLU, as part of a settlement with Facebook, also got some information there. So there's definitely ways that other groups working on this outside of journalists have made these requests and are attempting to answer a different set of questions that actually might just feed into a story. But with respect to different trends that we see, I think with COVID, something that I'm seeing that's very interesting is sort of this like COVID surveillance off-ramp situation where
what do you mean by that?
Different groups might sort of be open to establishing surveillance mechanisms in reaction to the minimizing frictionless interactions in the COVID era. So they might, for example, I'm thinking of specific products, facial recognition products we were monitoring that pivoted to fever detection. So it would encourage like residential landlords or different sort of property owners to install this technology in their building in order to monitor, residents, and that would incentivize them to invest in this surveillance infrastructure. And I think that this current moment where people are worried about the pandemic, and as a result of that, and Rashida kind of alluded to it happening in the education space as well, of, because of COVID, we're gonna have tests online. Okay, as part of this online class, you have to install this PagerU, ProctorU, application, and it's going to monitor this element of how you do exams or how you do assignments, and that kind of technology, that surveillance technology, propagating post-COVID and setting up a lot of infrastructure to further surveil people even after the pandemic is over. So I think I'm noticing that happening, and in particular with the facial recognition space, where that's become a place where now you might have someone saying like, okay, well, because of COVID, we don't want residents touching the doorknob, so we're going to have facial recognition as an access point into the building. And it seems reasonable in the light of COVID, but then that infrastructure is still there post-COVID, and it sets up a new sort of precedent with respect to surveillance. Another example is contact tracing, and how a lot of people embrace that as a way to address the issues of, keeping track of infection rates, but then that may be translating to keeping track of protesters or whoever else once authority figures evolve. So I'm noticing that happening in this current moment around, how COVID will affect us afterwards and how that connects to surveillance topics.
Yeah, I think COVID could be a real turning point in terms of the, biometric information collected about us. Somebody was telling me that, if we have the normalization of the collecting of our temperature, that can be telling, especially with women, that your temperature changes somewhat, when you're ovulating or when you're pregnant. And so if your employer from here on out takes your temperature every time you walk into the building, they could theoretically detect when their employees are becoming pregnant. We only have 2 minutes left, so I would like to give Rashida, we have 4 minutes left, actually. Rashida wanted to answer that question, and then let's get Rashida. Hannah, did you want to weigh in on this one as well?
I'll just close out at the end.
Okay, Rashida.
Okay, my quick tips is to remain skeptical of most smart city projects because they're often introduced as neutral or helping some community, and then surveillance technologies are usually embedded within that, or it leads to the creation of sketchier tech. And generally, like a lot of these projects are surveillance in themselves, but just marketed as smart cities. So just be careful about like language that's used within government, because it's often used to obfuscate what's actually being integrated. And then another thing to consider is the integration of biometrics in particular into other administrative functions, whether it's voting or other processes, because that's sort of the next step that a lot of vendors are looking towards. If they can build a relationship with a government agency with one tool or one product, then showing that it's possible to integrate other tools and other technologies into it is a way to sort of keep that contract going. So look at these sort of procurement processes that are already in place and be very skeptical of the language that's being used.
And I'm going to have one last question. Hannah, you can address this, but it's just, we have these new technologies because there are some benefits to them. Like, we wouldn't be bringing these new systems in if they're completely terrible. And so how do you as a journalist balance that? The benefits of some of these systems and then the harms that are built into them. And Hannah, you can address that if you have something else. You can do something else, but that would be my last question about the session.
No, that's a great question, Cash. Like, I would say that the best thing that a journalist can do is probably the thing that, God willing, brought you into journalism, which is to try to uncover hidden stories, to uncover things that are currently not, centered in the American experience. And so human beings, like Black and brown and poor and queer communities aren't Luddites. They don't hate technology. Mm-hmm. It's just that technologies are not designed for the visionary purposes of community transformation that have been long practiced and embedded in our communities all over our cities and all over this country and all over the world. So ask communities, what are the technologies that would bring you liberation, that would bring you power, that would deal with the conflicts and the solutions that you have centered? And often there are technologies that they're either already building or practicing, like community mesh wireless networks are currently solving the digital divide in Philadelphia and Detroit, all over the country, is one example, in small ways. And so the more we center the solutions coming from our own communities and the visions of how technologies can bring us liberation rather than enhance and embed oppression more deeply, the more that we can actually put concrete economic resources, scientific, brain power, and collaborative development, into the spotlight. And that's a great role for journalists today.
I love that. Deb?
Yeah, I think that, there's an interesting quote from Tawana Petty, who leads the Detroit community project, sort of resisting facial recognition, sort of invasion of their city. And she told me an interesting story of how, her group was initially conceived as a way to provide digital access and digital literacy, where they were worried that there were low-income members of the community that didn't have access to computers and to the technology. They saw the technology as this positive force that they were trying to bridge their community to. And I think that's still at the heart of a lot of these efforts, although they kind of end up by necessity becoming a resistive force to the way big tech is evolving. Ultimately, what they want is a version of technology that serves the benefits of their community and cares about the protection of their community. So I think that there is definitely a lot of ways that technology can do that. It's just that presently a lot of those directing the way that technology is developed might not necessarily either think about those communities at all, just by virtue of out of sight, out of mind, or are not prioritizing the well-being of those communities when they develop these tools. They're not necessarily leveraging the technology for the benefit of those groups. They're leveraging it for the benefit of perhaps a more privileged group to the detriment of those groups. So I think that there's definitely a lot of great things that technology can do. It's allowing us to have this conference right now and allowing us to share this information with you guys. But there definitely needs to be some level of accountability with respect to how do you balance that, the needs of one group with the reality of another group that is in a more vulnerable position.
Okay, well, this was an amazing chat. These are incredible experts in this field. I hope that you all annoy them with requests for help on stories. We're going to continue a kind of informal conversation in the chat on the page, the O&A page that our session was listed on. And it's just been such a pleasure to talk with the three of you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.